Japan's emergence as an economic superpower has imparted confidence and prowess not only to its commerce, industry and science, but also to its cultural life. While Japanese cities appear to be chaotic, mostly due to their large size and exceptional density, beneath this immense congestion and ceaseless agitation, there lies a well-functioning network of everyday communication and a complex culture. The shortage of space and the ever-present risk of earthquakes have largely mitigated against the pattern of high-rise mega-development that has come to characterize the downtowns of so many Western cities. These factors, plus a generally high level of affluence, have led to extensive low to medium-rise construction throughout the islands, affording many young architects a chance to try out new ideas. Much of the more interesting work assumes the form of small introspective structures hidden within these vast metropolitan regions and ranging in scale from civic buildings to private houses. This intense activity has caused some people to call this the new golden age of Japanese design. 6 brilliant individuals stand out among the significant Japanese architects of recent times. Their ages span across 2 generations. Of these, Katsuo Shinohara is the oldest and possibly the most visionary figure, an intellectual and a designer of eccentric houses in which the expression has ranged from the reinterpretation of tradition to apocalyptic set pieces. Shinohara has been a seminal influence on the younger generation. Itsuko Hasegawa is not only the youngest but also the most successful pupil of Shinohara. Hasegawa's architecture, frequently clad in lightweight perforated metal screens, often appears to be the conscious manifestation of a new technological nature that in part compensates for the absence of natural forms in the Japanese megalopolis. Toyo Ito, born in 1944, is the closest in age to Hasegawa. In his more recent work, he has made extensive use of lightweight standard metal components as a kind of everyday architectural equivalent to the commonplace Japanese woodblock print, creating an architecture that, in principle at least, ought to be available to the society at large. Educated at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard, Fumihiko Maki, born in 1928, is the most westernized architect of the group. While he has practiced continuously and extensively for almost 30 years, his metal-clad, elegantly articulated civic works of the last decade have projected him to international prominence. He is now the architect laureate of his generation. The main contender for this title, however, is the equally brilliant but slightly younger Arata Izuzaki. The cosmopolitan Izuzaki has played a critical role, both as an architect and as an intellectual. Of recent date, his architecture has assumed a particularly postmodern form in which historical quotations are mixed with abstract geometrical elements faced with synthetic modern materials. Tadao Ando is the only architect of the 6 who is not based in Tokyo. Shinto minimalist in terms of his formal preferences, Ando's trademark has been a particularly flawless form of reinforced concrete construction in which the freestanding pillar and containing wall are played off each other like characters in a drama. Light is of the utmost importance to Ando, and his massive introspective works are miraculously transformed under the impact of sunlight. Most of these architects are located in Tokyo, but they work all over the Japanese islands so that one finds interesting work throughout the country, not just in Tokyo itself. Perhaps one of the most unique and distinguishing features, I think, in all this is the caliber and the adventurous nature of Japanese clients and developers. I think one notices this frequently, particularly now, where private developers are willing to invest quite large sums of money in producing adventurous buildings, very well made, very well finished, very unique and radical in the way they are conceived and sited and so on. Born in 1925 and trained first as a mathematician and then as a physicist, Shinohara was almost 30 before he started to study architecture at the Tokyo Institute of Technology. Shinohara is a kind of eminent maverick or guru rather than an architect in the more traditional sense. After his graduation, he stayed on to teach. Since then, his interests have naturally tended towards the academic rather than the purely professional. The younger generation has been thoroughly influenced by him, largely because he was one of the first to have treated the private house as a kind of introspective utopia, a self-contained oasis in the urban chaos. In his own house of 1984, he departed very radically from the Japanese architectural tradition.
I like Japanese architectural tradition. It is very meaningful for me, and I know that there is much to draw upon. But I don't see it as my role as a modern architect to only make use of this legacy. Of course, some ideas from that tradition can survive in modern times. So traditional ideas may be a starting point for me, but never a destination. And that is a decision I made at the very beginning.
Katsuo Shinohara is the oldest, I suppose, slightly older than Isozaki, and has always been a figure apart in a way, and has thought of himself as a man apart, I think. An indication of that is that during the period of what one could think of as the high Japanese post-war modern architecture of Tange and Miyakawa, the period of the Tokyo Olympic Stadium, for example, Shinohara was building domestic houses in a sort of quasi-traditional manner and would not have been recognizable as a modern architect. Until very recently, his houses were reinterpretations of traditional Japanese domestic architecture, but when he started to use reinforced concrete, his manner abruptly changed. Typical of his later work is the house under high-tension wires, completed in 1981. The profile of the sweeping concrete roof is determined by the necessity of keeping a specific distance from high-tension wires that pass close to the site. The result is that the silhouette of the roof has a certain arbitrary, surrealistic quality. Faced in glass and glass block on the garden side, this house combines ribbed concrete construction with metal infill panels and traditional timber detailing. With its vibrant use of color, this house meets the architect's self-imposed standards of rendering the house as a work of art. At the same time, the arbitrary superimposition of the shell roof has produced a violently sculpted volume that approximates to Shinohara's concept of savage space.
For me, an ordinary private residence is as essential an expression of architecture as a very large project. When I work on houses, I have an opportunity to analyze and learn about architecture in general.
And here one has an architect who created a domestic environment that made allusion to traditional values, even sometimes traditional components, shoji screens, etc., and so on and so forth. But at the same time, these elements always appeared in a very, in a spatial environment which was a very, very powerful image, a kind of almost disturbing, very extremely disturbing, arresting image. This was really, I think, Shinohara's primary contribution and accounts for his influence on the younger generation. While Shinohara's fame, combined with his academic refinement, has enabled him to obtain larger commissions, his office has nonetheless remained small and idiosyncratic, hidden in an inner suburb of Yokohama, staffed by young Japanese graduates and foreign students. His method of work is to proceed intuitively, starting with a spatial or sculptural symbolic image, rather than with a plan of organization. Sometimes he speaks of his works as though they have come into being like highly emotional dream states over which he does not have full control. I am trying to envisage a house made up of sign-like language, naked things, machines, and savagery. I want to believe that this approach contains the seed of a new theory of building, but instead it may be oriented towards disintegration. Among his larger buildings is the Ukiyo-e Museum built near Tokyo. The skin and internal volume of this curtain-walled structure are both modulated by large cutout forms that impose kanji-like solids onto the exterior of the building. One may regard the recently completed monumental Centennial Hall, which now serves as a gateway for the Tokyo Institute of Technology, as Shinohara's ultimate savage machine. In a naive sense, it is undeniably machine-like in its appearance, and its forms are violently disjunctive. This is immediately evident in the arbitrary combination of a rectangular volume and an oval tube faced in steel that sits astride the main body like some crowning topknot on the head of a priest.
Originally, the program called for a technology museum to display instruments and machines. But then, the university decided to expand the role of the museum to include the exchange of ideas. I was very pleased about this new plan as it offered better design opportunities. The first image that came to mind was a cylinder floating in the air. Then I conceived of a cube as a supporting structure for this cylinder. From the beginning, I saw it as a half cylinder, bent slightly in the middle, one end providing a view of the railroad station to symbolize the outside world, and the other directing the viewer to the campus, signifying the inside world of the university. Earthquake safety codes account for the slanted design of the walls. But it is interesting to me that you should see traditional Japanese forms, such as kanji, our alphabet, in geometric shapes like circles, arcs, and cylinders, which are for me simple, pure, and primary forms.
The space and equipment inside the hall corresponds to that sense of unusual usualness so much sought after by Shinohara, wherein pipes and ventilating tubes intersect with each other in accordance with different contrapuntal axes. The exterior, faced throughout in stainless steel, aluminum and glass, articulated at the ground floor by cutout screens of perforated metal, suggests a counter-influence on Shinohara coming from his main disciples, Toyo Ito and Itsuko Hasegawa. Since opening her own office in 1972, Itsuko Hasegawa has stressed the symbolic significance of her architecture. While she has always respected the modest resources and needs of her clients, a tension remains in her work between the realistic metropolitan context in which she usually builds and her desire to create a feminist architecture evocative of esoteric Oriental traditions.
To label my work either realist or symbolist is too simplistic. I see my architecture as truly Asian in spirit, which means that I take into consideration the complex principles governing family life, religion, and many other social aspects. Everything in daily life is intertwined, and my architecture reflects that.
The work of Hasegawa is particularly distinguished by her use of modern as-found materials, her revitalization of the machine aesthetic of the early modern movement, which, although it was meant to be mass-produced and use everyday materials, was often very purpose-made. In her case, she has sought out the ordinary kind of products of the industrial society, like extruded aluminum, wire mesh, and above all, of course, perforated punch metal sheet, be it aluminum or stainless steel, which she's used to create a kind of layered, poetic screen around her works, sometimes mixed with natural planting. Sensitively inserted within a congested, largely two-story urban fabric, Hasegawa's Biwai house typifies her preoccupation with the symbolic void to be found in many of her works. In this instance, the void appears in the form of an entry stairwell that serves all the rental floors of this diminutive office building, which also happens to house her own studio on the top floor.
The design for the Biwai house is very straightforward, but what is unique is that the rear is made of concrete, while the front is constructed out of steel. This use of steel made construction of the concrete part much easier. But it is also a metaphor for the site which straddles the border of downtown and uptown Tokyo. So the use of several materials reflects the busy jumble of the neighborhood. Tokyo is full of low tile-roofed homes and workshops that surround high-rise buildings. The new and old, tall and short, coexist in happy chaos. The problem for me is to introduce something new into this bizarre geological landscape, something that would be perceived as natural to my contemporaries in Tokyo. This I call the new nature. An example is the greenery on the facade of Biwai House, which was inspired by the bonsai plants in the tiny gardens of the homes of this area. This brought my building into harmony with the neighborhood.
Many of our houses comprise collage-like assemblies of massive concrete and lightweight metal. In the Narima house, these materials take on the form of a diaphanous cocoon that becomes increasingly brilliant as day succeeds to night. A similar transformation occurs in the Kumamoto house, which appears to be a city in miniature because of the fragmented, pyramid-shaped monitor lights around the perimeter of the building. The Bizan Hall Music School has a monastic courtyard structure covered by a lightweight, high-tech metal roof, the whole being delicately inserted into the fragmented complexity of the surrounding urban fabric. Like the works of many of her contemporaries, Hasegawa's introspective houses often present a fortified appearance on their outer perimeter. This is dramatically manifest in the house built in Higashi Tamagawa. The bastion-like street frontage of this secret paradise is enlivened by the arabesques of the lightweight screens above. The undulating curve running through the perforated metal perimeter serves to emphasize the play between light and heavy that is to be found throughout.
In the case of this residence, I have chosen the shapes of clouds and the silhouettes of hills to reintroduce an element of nature into this artificial landscape. Wherever there isn't nature, I try to introduce it. And where there is plenty of nature, I want my architecture to be absorbed by it. Asian architecture has its origins in housing. Therefore, for me, the prototypical building in architecture is the home. At the beginning of my career, I worked on very modest houses, which usually are built here by carpenters without the help of architects. These carpenters are used to working with housewives and were therefore quite at ease with me. I learned a lot and built up my confidence to try larger projects. But then came the confrontation between male and female. So now my life is more difficult. My trademark is empty interior spaces in the houses I design. I call these spaces the void or hollow, a place where no furniture is placed. Life in Tokyo is so fast-paced that I feel that to assign a fixed function to a space would immobilize and reduce the flexibility of people living there. An empty space allows for change. In Japan, to be empty means to be full of potential for something new. During the 70s, the houses I worked on had very low budgets, but with the boom of the 80s, my clients began to demand much more. They wanted me to incorporate fashionable European ideas, and they were no longer content with the bare minimum and wanted to enjoy living in their houses. So that influenced me, and my outlook changed as well.
In her recent competition entry for a cultural center in Fujisawa, for example, she conceived of this work in opposition to the great public monuments of the 60s in Japan, the town halls built by Tange and others, which she sees as being primary for the glorification of local politicians and a representation of power, in a sense, in its most naked aspect.
I won this commission in an open competition. Members of the jury included Maki and Isozaki, who seemed to understand my approach of considering the needs and the wishes of the users. It is an ambitious undertaking. It has a civic hall, gymnasium, children's museum, galleries, a planetarium, and a theater. In the beginning, the town dwellers saw it as something outlandish, but as they became more involved, they now consider it their own.
A graduate of the prestigious Tokyo University, Toyo Ito is preoccupied with the nomadic aspects of urban life. In this regard, he has always been sensitive to the collage-like superficiality of the modern metropolis. For him, the city is a vast stage set within which his inexpensive architecture is embedded, like a theatrical screen drawn over a harsh reality.
In the late 60s, Hasegawa and I were working in the same architect's office, but that was before we began to influence each other. Then Hasegawa went to work for Shinohara, and I started my own office. It was at that time that we began to be influenced greatly by Shinohara. When you look at our current work, I think you will find a lot of similarities between us. For instance, I like to use the same type of materials as she does. When I was on my own in the early 70s, many architects were talking about the relationship between architecture and the city. It was a time of change. The ideas of the 60s were losing ground, and at this time, Shinohara and Isozaki came up with the new attitudes towards the city. They were trying to create an introspective utopia, a way of isolating the inner world of the house from the jarring chaos of the city. So, in those days, only Shinohara and Isozaki had such well-defined ideas, and they influenced me a great deal.
建築のあり方というのが僕には大変魅力的に思われたわけです。
Toyo Ito is interesting because, in a sense, he bridges, in a way, in terms of his own development, from the architecture of Tadao Ando on the one hand and Itsuko Hasegawa on the other. Because when he started off in the mid-70s with his early houses, which were always in reinforced concrete construction, massive walled kind of enclosures with central courtyards, like the house that he designed for his sister.
I designed this house for my sister about 10 years ago. I want to make this house as an utopia against the city. So it was very closed from the outside, and the central court is closed double walled. Now there is many grasses, but first 3 years no grass and only black soil. And for me it was very interesting and very curious to see black soil in the central part of the city. Everything is contrast. For example, inside it's all white and abstract.
The house Ito built for his sister in the mid-70s, that he characterizes as a white U, is a work in which he was profoundly influenced by the early savage concrete houses of Shinohara. Nonetheless, his own theatrical preoccupations are evident in this work. The living room consists of a long, irregular ring in concrete, sporadically lit by the occasional top light or side window. One constantly feels that there is some part of this volume that remains perpetually unseen, and that from this graduated darkness, a new protagonist will emerge, like an actor entering on a stage.
Since the 70s, I've changed a lot, and my work has changed as well. Particularly in the 80s, I've taken a very different direction. Traveling in Southeast Asia has made a great impression on me, and of course, Tokyo interests me very much. I see it as a Blade Runner city, with its skyscrapers surrounded by low-rise barracks. These barracks and huts are actually everywhere in Southeast Asia. In most of these countries, people still lead rich lives in their barracks. But in Tokyo, that is not possible anymore. Life is artificial, like living in a TV set.
テレビのホームドラマのステージセットのようなものを組み立てて、その中でしか暮らしてないんじゃないか。ヨーロッパの街と僕が一
If I
番
were to compare it to European cities, I would say that Tokyo is like theater, while Paris, London, and Rome are like museums. I think architecture should respond to the theatrical and temporary nature of Tokyo. So I'm not looking for a very uniform fixed space, but rather something lightweight and flexible. In contrast to the idea of an introspective utopia, I began to feel I should open up my architecture to the spirit of Tokyo. In the house I built for myself, the Silver Hut, I tried to accomplish this.
Next to his sister's U-shaped house in Tokyo's Nakano district stands Ito's own Silver Hut, a work of exceptional complexity. At first encounter, it may be read as being based on a traditional Japanese 9-square plan. The concrete columns not only frame the solid and perforated light metal screens of the enclosure, but also support the open latticework vaults that define but do not fully enclose the central court. At the same time, one may interpret this courtyard house as a kind of science fiction synthesis of the Mediterranean atrium and the Bedouin tent.
でその時にその東京を見まし
He's
てみる
moved
と
closer and closer to the same kind of lightweight, extraordinary, ordinary, machine-made architecture. exploiting again as-found materials, aluminum, sheet metal, perforated metal again, and geodesic tetrahedron construction, somewhat like the early pioneering work of Buckminster Fuller. And it's interesting to that he is sort of reinterpreting the Southeast Asian basic dwelling, in modern as-found technological terms.
Although the U-shaped house and the silver hut are next door to each other, they represent a 10-year process in the evolution of my thinking. Japanese houses are like an empty stage in a theater. You bring in some furniture to create a scene. The furniture suggests the interaction of people on a stage set.
There is a connection between Ito's theatrical spaces and the traditional tea house concept, in which the enclosure was seen as being brought to life through the ritual itself.
In this house, I covered the furniture with a thin veil to express the impermanence and theatrical aspects of this architecture. My idea is to search in the forest of the city for unusual but ordinary materials and use them in my architecture. That's one of my main interests.
In this ventilator tower built outside Yokohama Station, a perforated aluminum cylindrical screen breaks up at night into an expressive cascade of sparkling lights.
Many Japanese architectures use asymmetrical compositions, always trying to give balance using the distance between those elements. And this house has a center, very pronounced, the center. But when you look at the both sides, it is not symmetrical building.
After graduating from Tokyo University, Fumihiko Maki studied at Harvard, where he encountered the informal domestic manner developed by Walter Gropius and José Luis Sert. This approach is very evident in the design of his own house, a combination of traditional American vernacular elements with modern abstract forms. The house is in the center of Tokyo, where he grew up.
Yes, that's right.
The other thing that intrigues me, and it relates to your experience in the United States, is that there seems to me that there is a very discrete quotation from American clapboard.
Clapboard, yes. That particular part of the wall was not concrete, made of just wooden panels. And I might have used that clapboard without too much consciousness.
Yes.
Since I studied under the José Luis Sert in the United States, I must say I have learned a great deal about the urban theory of Western world as well. And coming back to Tokyo, my practice was pretty much built on my experiences in the city of Tokyo. I believed in incremental development in the city. The act of making a building is also the act of place making. The spiral faces Aoyama Boulevard, one of the busiest and very fashionable streets in Tokyo. And the street scenes of Tokyo today, they are very fragmented. So I decided to use the spiral as a commentary of this fragmentation. And I used a number of familiar iconographic features of modern art and modern architecture as elements, then made up quite unfamiliar totality out of those familiar elements. This was a concept of spiral.
Can you explain to me the idea?
Yes. This is a complex of a building which has a number of functions, cafe, restaurants, exhibition space, but I wanted to combine all of them in a certain way so that people can appreciate those functions simultaneously. The whole space is for rent.
So even the gallery wall is rented?
Even the gallery walls are rented. They don't have their own collections. Here, so, yes.
What do you use the space for?
Oh, this is for performances and installations. While you are having coffee or tea, you could enjoy the street scenes. and we have daylight coming from the top. This place is a public space, and quite often people are just sitting on those chairs looking at outside. And those millions, the distance between millions have a geometrical progression. So it gives, again, a sense of a movement.
Of rising upwards.
Yes, rising up. So this building tries to develop the number of the scenes, succession or sequences of scenes. Yes.
So it culminates here in this sculpture?
Done by,
Aiko Miyawaki.
That's right, yes. Whenever I see so-called great movies, I remember some of those unforgettable scenes. And when I design the buildings, I want also to build a number of important sceneries around which I could construct the rest. And I find certain similarity between how the movie directors approach to his movies and architecture I approach. Fujisawa Gymnasium I built 3 years ago is sited at the fringe of one of the satellite cities of Tokyo, which is called Fujisawa. And it is in one of industrial development areas. The given context is close to nil, or I would say very bleak. And in this case, instead of following the given context, I wanted to use the new gymnasium to be a base of developing a new context for that particular city. When you look at the old Japanese cities, the only monumental or public buildings are castles, temples, or shrines. And those buildings' existence are already pronounced through the great roofs over the houses. I wanted to make these roofs which convey the sense of publicness. And in order to achieve that, I used a number of curves to make those spaces in a manner quite close to our tradition. The forms are somewhat similar to a samurai helmet, although I was not too conscious to follow that tradition, but at the end it came out as if they are reflection of those art forms.
The shell-like forms of the Fujisawa Gymnasium are covered with a 4mm thick skin of stainless steel. These wrinkle-free panels were specially developed by the manufacturer for this building. Through their evocation of medieval armor and space-age technology, Maki sees these dynamic metal forms as evoking both past and future culture.
Perhaps you can see how the steel frames and concrete elements are put together. And sometimes we make those connections in rather brutal ways. It's a crashes between the two. Fortunately, in Japan today, I observe we have both technology and surviving craftsmanship.
The Fujisawa complex consists of 2 separate primary volumes roofed with metallic shell-like structures and linked by a 2-story entrance lobby feeding both gymnasiums. The large oyster-shaped volume accommodates the main multipurpose sports arena capable of seating 2,000. Its spectacular internal volume is spanned by 240-foot-long welded steel trusses. In addition to admitting light, these trusses also carry the shell roof, which spans between them and the outer perimeter of the concrete seating.
Some architects in Japan use Western ornaments in a very expressive way or in a latent way. I used some such ornaments. To me, a still more important element in architecture is details. And seems to be these good details give a pleasure to eyes, just as much as you get from ornamentation. So I try to stick to these modernist principles. And also, it is the only way you can convey the spirit of the material we use today, like steel, glass, concrete. Without the details, you cannot extract the energy which resides in those materials.
I feel very free this moment. I like to keep distance both to the so-called modernist with pure geometry and also same time historical element and also vernacular element. And I like to keep same distance to Japanese history or to European history. So I can be very free to combine those quartet elements. And also in such a process, I'm thinking to develop some special method to, once to look from one side very modern, from other side postmodern, other side very classic, other side very something different. So I like to be in such a situation.
The recently completed addition to the existing classical Ochanomizu Square buildings in downtown Tokyo offered Isozaki an ideal situation in which to contrast European and Japanese references and to play with the rather disparate expressive forms of modern and postmodern architecture. Here he differentiates between the neoclassical side wings and the square windows that characterize the new central block of the complex, together with the light metal lattice pergola that spans over the geometrically articulated entrance, faced in stainless steel. This complex is a multi-purpose building combining public offices, the music auditorium, and a large reception hall. Here it was used for the wedding of one of Isozaki's young assistants. It is typical of Isozaki that he would find time in his crowded schedule to attend this event in an official capacity. It is equally characteristic that he and his wife, Aiko Miyawaki, would be the only ones wearing traditional kimonos on the occasion of an otherwise totally Western marriage ritual. A similar split between traditionalism and modern form can be found in the building itself, where classical stone capitals are set in strong contrast to stainless steel tubular columns.
Almost from the beginning of my career, I try to use irony as much as possible. Sometimes it worked, but sometimes it didn't work. Sometimes it make a quite nice joke, but sometimes it make a bad joke. And gradually I found if I could work without irony, my method could be more rigid and stronger than before. Now, the more likely to escape from complicated ironical method, more straightforward design to grasp something much more stronger image. So that's my present feeling.
Sometimes, in some ways, to me, this whole hall seems to be somewhat Scandinavian in feeling. It reminds me of Asplund.
Classicism of
yes,
the
neoclassicism.
I
right,
see.
right. It reminds me of Asplund somewhat.
Every time I face some special situation, I try to find a kind of context, city, cultural, historical, mental environment, everything.
Isozaki's architecture has changed considerably over the past 15 years, passing from the metal-clad geometrical forms that characterized his civic work in the 70s, as in his glass block and metal-clad Kamioka Town Hall completed in 1978, to the eclecticism of his Tsukuba city center completed in 1982, in which the stainless steel geometric forms of his earlier style were violated by different kinds of disjunctive historical quotations. Isozaki has described Tsukuba as being representative of his high ironic manner, and he now sees his architecture as abandoning irony in favor of a more fine-grained synthesis of elements drawn from many different sources. This synthesis has perhaps been most successful in Isozaki's Museum of Contemporary Art in Los Angeles of 1982. Here on the Pacific Rim, Eastern and Western elements are merged together to create a new geometrical and material unity. As Isozaki asserts, we live in a time in which no single form of civic architecture is universally accepted, neither classic, nor modern, nor postmodern. For him, this means that architects are free to combine elements from very different origins.
To find these trees and also to
In this regard, his more recent Musashi Hill Golf Club is typical, where an eclectic assembly of diverse forms is consciously fused with the landscape.
One of the famous Japanese shrines.
Nothing could be further from Izuzaki's earlier intellectualism, as exemplified in his Fujimi Country Club of 1978, in which the plan, in the shape of a question mark, subtly ridicules the post-war Japanese obsession with golf.
Now I understand why Japanese people play golf, because of, but still I don't play, but many people like or have to do because of their business or lack of sports in the daily life. They must come and to play. I think not necessary to have iron at all. It's better to give to them more comfort or more pleasure visiting here or walking around and playing and dining. When first I came here, I had in mind kind of a tower to symbolize this building. Also, same time, it could be a landmark. When people play golf far distance, they can see something. So that should be tower. I didn't imagine it looks like pagoda, but similar images, similar idea, because pagoda has basically 4 columns with many layered stories.
Since the creation of this golf club entailed the elimination of a number of trees, Izuzaki chose to commemorate this loss metaphorically through 4 timber columns set within the tower.
So in such a way, I'm going to try to get more elements with more metaphors related to this memory of this site. And also same time, the dimension of the trees inside. It is almost exact height to one of the important shrines in Japan. And this shrine had always 4 big trees. And this was also a coincidence. I didn't refer originally, but I tried to get as large timber as possible. So the height became the same.
I look upon my architecture as my children. I want them nearby so I can keep track of them in case they have problems, for instance, deterioration or neglect. I don't want them to be too far from my office. 2 hours driving distance is ideal.
From the point of view of his origins, Ando, born in 1942, is perhaps the most unique architect of the 6. Unlike the other architects who are all Tokyo-based, he practices in his native city of Osaka. Moreover, he was never formally trained as an architect. While he has realized some 40 buildings, for which he has received numerous awards, no one really knows how he acquired his consummate skill as an architect. To varying degrees, his capacity derives from an informal craft education, from working on building sites, and from extensive travel throughout the world. The story has it that he earned his living as a boxer during his youth. But even this is shrouded in uncertainty.
When I was in high school, I began to spend time in carpenters' workshops. And as a young man, I looked at all important architecture, both old and new, and I even worked at construction sites. The danger to architects is that once they reach a certain stage, they receive ever larger commissions for trendy commercial buildings. They have no time to be really innovative, and as a result, the number of big but meaningless buildings in Japan is on the rise. For me, if a building exceeds a certain size, it is no longer architecture. There is a scale to architecture. No matter how small a building is, it can have profound architectural meaning.
The design of this recently completed Catholic church on the top of Mount Rocco appears to be consciously suspended between Occidental and Oriental values. It consists of 2 distinct components, a reinforced concrete basilica and a totally glazed arcade. On entering this arcade, the eye is led towards an animistic view of nature. This translucent tunnel evokes the spirit of Shinto, reminiscent of the symbolic gates leading to the Inari Shrine in Kyoto. This approach proceeds through a dim threshold into the unexpected volume of the church itself, variously illuminated by a large side window and narrow light slots. Ando-san, I wonder if you could tell me how you came to get this commission in the first place. While many of Ando's larger buildings have been built for the Japanese fashion industry, his religious works have been mainly commissioned by developers or private clients. Situated in a mountainous national park near Kobe, the Mount Rocco Chapel was built as an annex to a famous resort hotel.
Here we are inside a confined room, a chamber, but frankly speaking, I didn't want those ceilings. I wanted just the walls standing or floating almost, and when you look up, you only see sky.
The black welded steel cross, suspended on tension cables over the altar, demonstrates Ando's insistence on employing modern materials, no matter how traditional the context might be.
Yes, the wall that surrounds the courtyard, this is a very much Japanese garden landscaping tradition. And this gives depth to what you can see. And to have in the distance another different type of green, and then in the foreground, green. And I wanted to bring in the Western and the Japanese, have them overlap, and create a new chapel.
Ando's Rocco apartments of 1982 were designed for a hitherto unbuildable slope situated at the foot of Mount Rocco, overlooking the city of Kobe. Derived from the tradition of stepped terrace housing that lines the shores of the Mediterranean, Ando provides for two alternative modes for reaching each apartment, an elevator and an open stairway. This luxury housing complex comprises 12 floors of apartments built of precision-formed concrete.
Concrete is not the most commonplace material in modern Japanese architecture, so I studied it thoroughly to get the best possible results. In order to convince my clients to let me use concrete, I had to be able to offer a concrete reminiscent of the delicacy and lightness of paper, which we Japanese are so used to.
In this space, you also have a kind of synthesis of both the Oriental conception of the alley, the urban alley, and the kind of reference to the Western plaza, for example.
Yeah.
The central open stairway begins as a continuous flight, rising directly up the slope. From the middle level, however, vertical access on foot is provided by an open stair sandwiched between the two wings of the housing complex. The elevators also change over at this level, and it is necessary to cross the plaza from one elevator to the next in order to continue to the top.
The bamboo bush there was there from the beginning, so that's something that existed naturally. And then we brought in some new types of plants. And here also I'm trying to have nature penetrate into this complex from both sides. So once again we see nature coming in and into the lives of people here.
Tadao Ando is perhaps the most single-minded in pursuing a practice of modern architecture as a culture of resistance, if you like. Not only a resistance against the chaos of the megalopolis, but also the resistance against consumerism, against reducing culture simply to consumption. He does this in various ways. I mean, one way is, of course, to create a kind of enclave, which is either private or semi-public, like the Rocco housing. The other important aspect of his approach is his profound respect for nature and his effort to sort of reintroduce nature into a modern architecture, not in terms of just greenery, as in we see it here in Rocco, but also in terms of light and wind and climatic change. Nowhere is this more apparent than in Ando's Kushino house, dating from 1981, built as a weekend residence for the fashion designer Junko Kushino. It consists of a compact courtyard house situated in the wooded suburbs of Osaka. The delicate aesthetic quality of its interior depends upon the articulation of its inner surface under the play of natural light.
I think space to live in should coexist in harmony with nature, and therefore I appreciate the traditional Japanese houses in which one can find this unity. I also want to make an architecture which would remind the Japanese of their old cultural sensitivities. I do this through something very Western, geometric forms. The movement of the sun changes the look of a building, which after all cannot move. The same is true for the interior of a building, and I make use of this attribute to enliven my architecture. This window is the right height for seeing the garden after a snowfall. It is the perfect height to enjoy the room extending into nature. Comfort means something different to different nationalities. What is comfortable for the Japanese may not be comfortable for Americans or Europeans, and vice versa. Modernist architects were mistaken to try to create one kind of comfort for everyone.
Throughout this century, Japanese culture has been characterized by an extreme tension between the ongoing influence of tradition and the disjunctive forces of modernization. And this has never been more obvious than in the evolution of Japanese modern architecture. This tension was already manifest in 1960 in Kenzo Tange's plan for Tokyo Bay and in his contemporaneous Olympic Stadium. More than a quarter of a century later, this patriarch of Japanese architecture remains convinced about the possibility of evolving an appropriate form for late metropolitan culture.
But Tokyo now becoming more and more information-oriented. To provide this coming information society, Tokyo didn't prepare. I am hoping most of the architects could find more proper way how they can express our information society, like modern architecture reflected industrial society.
While Tange's thinking may still be relevant to contemporary urbanism, as is suggested by his most recent proposals for Tokyo Bay, today's architectural leadership has long since passed to his immediate successors, Arata Isozaki and Fumihiko Maki, and even further to the next generation, to architects such as Toyo Ito and Itsuko Hasegawa, who are now coming into their prime as significant architects. There is a distinction to be drawn between architects like Tange and Maki, who both assume an optimistic, even technocratic attitude towards the process of modernization, evident in their faith that past and future values can still be reconciled, and architects like Isozaki, Ito, and Hasegawa, who take a more playful and skeptical attitude towards the late modern condition.
I'm pretty much a mixture of West and East. And today, the number of architects became more conscious of cultural resources and heritage. Architecture is always the testimony of the particular time, culturally, socially, economically. And I wanted to make my buildings to be able to reflect technology and the craftsmanship of that particular time.
Tokyo is exactly the same to New York in Europe too. So the idea I like to work is a kind of nomad. Nomad is always moving around, but sometimes nomad needs some base. I think for me, the Tokyo is good for this kind of base. But actually, my activity and also my working style is a kind of nomad this moment. So I think this makes me more comfortable to work than cosmopolitan way to think about the architecture.
While the post-60s generation remains critical of the mechanization of modern life, their specific attitudes to technology vary, from Shinohara and his followers who seem to feel that new techniques may be used to revitalize the Japanese architectural tradition, as evidenced in the Memorial Hall for the Tokyo Institute of Technology, to Ando, who opts for a more sensitive use of established modern materials and techniques as a way of revealing the transcendental view of nature that lies so deeply embedded in the Japanese tradition. As leadership passes from one generation to the next, we are left to wonder as to which rival version of the future will eventually prevail.
For many people, the days of modernism seem to be over. I don't feel that way. My approach to modernism is through Japanese traditional architecture, and therefore other possibilities remain. I think to come to new breakthroughs in modernism, advanced technologies hold the answer. When I began to practice architecture, Shinohara and Isazaki were in their prime. We learned a great deal from them, and they were important role models. We were impressed by their energy. They were truly important figures, for they showed us a totally different world of architecture. While I hope they continue their work, I think that our generation should play the same leadership role for those who follow us.
全く違う世界を彼らが垣間見せてくれて、我々にすごい刺激を与えてくれたわけですね。